Hello Stacker community, it's your friend Paul here. A fellow stacker asked me recently to put together a video discussing my views in more depth of the link between precious metals and energy. This is the first video that I'm putting together, so please pardon the quality. So anyway, here goes. I thought I'd start out with a little explanation of an analysis that I did discussing a comment that Chris Duane had made many months ago about the average salary of a Roman soldier back in ancient times. He basically said that a common laborer would earn as a salary about 1/10 of an ounce of silver for a hard day's worth of work. So I thought I'd translate that into energy and see what that would mean in terms of the value of silver. So assuming that a person can expend doing reasonably hard work on a sustained basis about the same amount of energy as it takes to walk 3 miles per hour. What I've figured is that the person can expend about 335 watts of energy. That's about 3 times the amount of energy as the average light bulb. Doesn't seem like a whole lot, but when you translate that into the amount of energy available in a gallon of gasoline, it turns out to be about 0.12 gallons of gasoline, assuming that you could burn that gallon of gasoline and get all of the energy available from it. Now, if we put that gasoline in an internal combustion engine that had about a 20% efficiency, which is about what an average internal combustion engine has, then that would be the equivalent of burning about 0.6 gallons worth of gasoline to produce work, to do common everyday tasks. So you can see it really is not that much energy. 0.6 gallons of gasoline for a full 12-hour day's worth of work doesn't seem like a whole heck of a lot, and in fact it's not, and that's why we're probably blessed to be living in today's age where fuel and energy is so abundant and cheap. So let's see what that 0.6 gallons of gasoline means. It would essentially mean that if a person was paid 1/10 of an ounce of silver for all of this labor, then 1 ounce of silver would purchase about 6 gallons worth of gasoline, which doesn't seem like a whole heck of a lot. But let's see how much gasoline an ounce of silver will buy today. Well, I looked up the price of silver. The spot market has it at about $22 per ounce. And the average gallon of gasoline in the US is selling for about $3.50. So if you divide those two numbers, it works out to be about 6.3. So that's the number of gallons of gasoline a silver ounce will purchase today. And you'll notice it's surprisingly similar to the 6 gallons of gasoline estimate that I obtained by just doing a little bit of math on the amount of effort a person can expend and the 0.1 ounce per day salary information that Chris Duane had given. So it seems fairly reasonable. Let's take a look at the costs of producing gold according to the Gold Fields 2010 annual report. They reported in that report that they produced about 3.5 million ounces of gold that year, and the cost of production was about $3.6 billion. And that was broken up as $1.9 billion in operating costs, which covers things like diesel fuel, electricity, water, maintenance on capital equipment, fairly high costs. So that all of these are basically related to the cost of energy. Obviously, the cost of diesel fuel and electricity are very important in a mining operation. Water takes energy to pump, and the maintenance on all the capital equipment obviously involves transportation. It involves production of steel parts, installation, break-in and wear-in. Then you go on to salaries. So this is human labor. So again, these are people working fairly hard for the company. Gold Fields paid out about $1 billion in salaries in 2010, and then we have other costs such as payments to capital providers of about a $250 million, and other costs for the total of $3.6 billion. Now, if you take these numbers and divide the number of ounces produced by the cost to produce it, it comes up to about $1,000 per ounce, which is the cost that Gold Fields incurred to make those 3.5 million ounces of gold in 2010. Now let's see what that would be expressed in terms of barrels of oil. So if we take the average price of oil in 2010, which was about $71 per barrel, West Texas Intermediate basis, if we took all this money that Gold Fields spent producing gold and instead bought oil with it, it means that the equivalent costs of production in terms of barrels of oil would have been about 50 million barrels. That's how many barrels that Gold Fields could have purchased with all their operating costs, which works out to about 14.3 barrels per ounce. Now keep that number in the back of your head, it'll be important later. Now if we take the average price of gold in 2010 in terms of dollars per ounce, it was about $1,200 per ounce, and if we express that in terms of barrels per ounce, that worked out to be about 17.2. So it cost Gold Fields the equivalent of about 14 barrels per ounce to produce the gold, and they actually made through sales 17 barrels per ounce energy equivalent. Now this is just a rough number. Obviously the price of gold is going to depend on the contracts, the nature of the contracts. They're obviously not going to be selling at spot. But just keep these numbers in the back of your head. So we have these rough benchmarks. We have the value of silver based on historical precedent at about 6 gallons of gasoline is what an ounce of silver would buy, or 300 gallons per 50 ounces. We have this number for gold, which is about 14.3 barrels per ounce to produce in 2010. Now let's consider what we can do to preserve our purchasing power going forward. If I take a look at data projecting back to 1968, this is about the time when gold and silver became freely traded on the U.S. market, and we divide the number of the cost per barrel by the dollar costs of an ounce of gold, and do the same thing with, let's say, 50 ounces of silver, just to put them on a comparable scale. We see that the price of oil, or price of gold in terms of barrels, is surprisingly stable. It moves around quite a bit, but it actually doesn't really trend. It just stays within a channel between 10 barrels and 25 barrels per ounce of gold. And the range is about similar for 50 ounces of silver. So 50 ounces of silver, when silver is cheap, would buy about 10 barrels of oil. When silver is fairly expensive, it would buy about 25 barrels of oil. And similarly with ounces of gold, when gold is cheap, an ounce will buy you about 10 barrels, and when it's expensive, you can see that it'll buy about 25 barrels. Now notice I put on the same chart how many barrels you could buy with a $100 bill. So going back to 1968, if you had a $100 bill, that $100 bill would buy you about 30 barrels worth of oil. And notice that if you held that $100 bill through to today, currently it would buy you approximately 1 barrel worth of oil. So this shows you just how quickly the value of the US dollar is going down relative to oil. But in contrast, you can see that gold and silver are maintaining their values fairly well over the past, let's say, 40 or 50 years. So you can see that by purchasing gold and silver, you're maintaining your purchasing power much more effectively than you would with the dollar. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't good and bad times to purchase gold and silver. Obviously there are better times than others. For example, if we take a look at silver back in April of 2011, you can see that it was fairly expensive, at least for the past 50 years, relative to the price of oil. So it topped out about there, and it's been going down for the past couple years, as all of us are well aware. Gold topped out similarly, and it's on its way back down too. But gold and silver are currently approaching the bottom of the channel, which means that we're getting pretty close to a fairly safe time to purchase. So if you have been purchasing over the past decade and a half, you're in a pretty good condition, because even if you've been purchasing over the past few years when gold and silver were expensive, you probably have a pretty good average cost. The best time to stack obviously was between 2000 and about 2009. Things got a little bit expensive towards 2010, 2011. They're getting cheaper now. So I would expect that over the next few years it's going to be a pretty good time to accumulate metals. So anyway, that's my rant for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, you found it interesting and educational. I'd appreciate your feedback. Obviously it's my first video, so it's probably going to be a little bit boring and maybe not of the quality that you expect from some of the other video producers, like Silverfish and Drutter and Big Silver One. Obviously it's going to be hard to compete with those guys. They're top notch. Well, anyway, folks, thanks for the inspiration. Hopefully you enjoyed. I'll talk to you later.